Welcome to Whispers Before Bed. Tonight's story is made for you to fall asleep. Our unheard Bob Lazar story. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of silence. True silence. Not just the absence of noise, but the presence of something deeper. The quiet hum of a desert at night. The kind of silence that almost feels like it's listening back. That's where this story begins. Chapter 1. The man behind the mystery, not in a laboratory, not in a news studio, not even on the front page of a conspiracy forum. No, this story begins in that quiet space between knowing and not knowing, between the comfort of certainty and the fragile wonder of asking, what if? Bob Lazar didn't ask to be famous. That's important. People often assume he wanted attention, that he craved the spotlight. But you don't step into the world and say, I worked on reverse engineering alien spacecraft for the US government, unless either something inside you is desperately true or desperately broken. And truth, as it turns out, has a price. In 1989, Bob Lazar came forward with claims that seemed straight from science fiction. He spoke of a place called S4, a hidden facility near the infamous Area 51, where he said he was hired to study advanced propulsion systems, not human systems, not experimental jets, but vehicles, not from here. Do you feel that? That slight tug in your chest? That quiet mix of curiosity and disbelief? That's the tension we all live in when faced with something that challenges the architecture of our reality. What do you do when someone stands in front of the world and calmly insists, I saw a technology you cannot imagine? Most people laughed. Others dismissed him. Some listened, then forgot. But a few leaned in because they recognized something familiar, not in the content of what he said, but in the courage it took to say it. And that's what tonight is really about. Because stories like Lazar's aren't just about aliens, or government secrets, or physics-defying propulsion systems. They're about us, about what we're willing to believe, about how much truth we can bear before we retreat back into the warmth of the familiar. Let me ask you something. Have you ever known something, or at least felt something, deeply in your bones? But when you tried to explain it, people dismissed you. They smiled politely. They called you dramatic, maybe even crazy. And part of you began to question your own clarity. Did I imagine it? Did I exaggerate? Now imagine living with that every day. That's Bob Lazar's world. He wasn't a polished speaker. He didn't try to convince anyone. He just told what he experienced in his own strange, unassuming way. And in that simplicity, there was a disarming power. He described the layout of the facility, the way the hangar doors blended into the mountainside, the crafts, small, metallic, saucer-shaped. He spoke about gravity amplifiers, element 115, and propulsion systems that didn't rely on traditional fuel, but on manipulating space-time itself. Do you remember when you first learned that space could bend? That gravity wasn't just a force, but a curvature in the fabric of the universe? That thought probably changed something in you, made the world feel less solid, more mysterious. That's the feeling Lazar gave people too, only more extreme. Because if what he said was true, then our whole narrative collapses. Our scientific models, our sense of place in the cosmos, our religious constructs, our power structures, they all start to look thin, provisional. That's not just unsettling, it's terrifying. But that's also where transformation begins. And I wonder, what would it mean for you to believe Lazar? Not blindly, not dogmatically, but open-heartedly. What would you gain? And what would you lose? Sometimes, belief isn't about adding a new truth. It's about being willing to let go of an old one. That's why stories like these don't just ask for your attention. They ask for your identity. And perhaps that's why so many resist. Because it's safer to believe that people like Bob Lazar are mistaken, or deluded, or fabricating. Because if he's not, then we are living in a much stranger world than we ever imagined. One where secrets aren't just hidden, they're protected by layers of disbelief. But the question remains, why him? Why would a soft-spoken physicist with a modest background step forward with claims that would upend his life? He lost jobs. He was ridiculed, watched, harassed. He didn't gain wealth, or status, or admiration. Just the opposite. That's not the behavior of a man seeking fame. That's the signature of something else. And here's where the story begins to bend inward. Because whether or not you believe Lazar, he makes you confront something in yourself. Your relationship with uncertainty. Your threshold for cognitive dissonance. Your willingness to say, I don't know, but I'm open. That's not easy. That's a kind of emotional maturity many never develop. But here, in the safety of this moment, with the night wrapped gently around us, you can. You can release the pressure to know for certain. You can let the story wash over you, not as doctrine, but as invitation, not as evidence, but as atmosphere. A moment to stretch your awareness beyond the confines of logic, into the quiet wonder of what might be. That's what bedtime is for, isn't it? To slip beyond the rigid borders of the day, to feel the porous boundary between the real and the imagined, between what we know and what might be waiting just beyond the edge of knowing. So tonight, let's not ask whether Bob Lazar is telling the truth. Let's ask instead, what does your truth do when it hears his? Does it recoil? Or does it awaken? Sometimes, when someone tells the truth, it doesn't sound like a revelation. It sounds like an inconvenience, uncomfortable, awkward, almost too simple. That's how Bob Lazar spoke. Not like a prophet, not like a whistleblower desperate for attention. More like a man who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally decided to set it down, right in front of us. He said he worked at S4, not Area 51, not the main site you've heard about on documentaries and late-night radio. S4 was separate, tucked into the side of Papoose Lake, camouflaged by the terrain. Secret even from secrets. If Area 51 was the myth, S4 was the footnote most weren't supposed to read. And inside that hidden facility, he claimed, were 9 craft, 9 machines, each one different, each one incomprehensible, except that they all defied what we thought was possible. He wasn't asked to fly them. He wasn't allowed to touch them. He was asked to understand just one thing: propulsion. How did it move? How did it bend space? What kind of engine creates gravity instead of resisting it? Just consider that for a moment. Not the science of it, but the psychological weight of such a task. Imagine walking into a room and seeing something you've never even conceived of. Not a car, or a jet, or a weapon, but something that seems to belong in another reality altogether. Something that shouldn't exist here. And then being told, figure it out. Do you feel how small that would make you? Or how alive? For most of us, mystery is a momentary thrill. But for Lazar, it became a burden. because he knew something most people didn't and wasn't allowed to talk about it. That tension, that's where transformation simmers, because when someone sees too much, they're never the same. And when they speak it aloud, they invite the rest of us to choose, stay safe or stay awake. Let me ask you something. Have you ever learned something that made you wish you hadn't? Something that made the world less comfortable, but more honest? That's what secrets do. They remove the veil, and once it's lifted, it doesn't go back down. Lazar didn't just reveal a secret, he revealed a pattern, a way of hiding, a whole architecture built to protect knowledge, not from enemies, but from us, from you, from me. The moment he went public, the game changed. His story was out. His credibility was questioned. His past, mysteriously, began to disappear. Records of his schooling vanished. His employment history grew murky. Places he claimed to have worked denied it. Degrees were missing. Paper trails evaporated. Now ask yourself, does that happen to liars? Or to those who've said too much? There's a psychological technique known as gaslighting, a method of making someone doubt their own reality, their memory, their clarity. Now imagine it on a societal level. What happens when someone tells a story that threatens the very way we define the real? The world begins to subtly rewrite itself to protect the dominant narrative. That's what makes Lazar's story so powerful. Not because it's flashy, but because it's quietly consistent. Because even decades later, he's never changed it. Not the details, not the tone, not the energy. He doesn't beg us to believe him. He simply refuses to pretend it didn't happen. There's something noble in that, something steady. It doesn't scream, it stands. And as you lie here, perhaps your body softening further into the quiet, into trust, maybe you're realizing that this story, it isn't really about him. Not anymore. It's about how we respond to things we don't understand. When you hear something that challenges your worldview, what do? Do you armor up, dismiss, laugh it off, or do you lean in? Real maturity isn't about having answers. It's about living alongside the unanswered, walking with it, letting the questions become companions instead of threats. And tonight, maybe that's your quiet empowerment. You don't need to land on certainty. You don't have to decide if Bob Lazar is telling the truth. What you can do is allow yourself to dwell in the space he opened. A space where reality isn't closed, but permeable. Where science isn't complete, but curious. Where belief isn't blind, but brave. Isn't that a more honest place to rest? Because the alternative is control. A world where only what's proven is allowed. Where wonder is filtered. But that's not the world you were born for. You were made to feel awe. To let go of what you think is possible. To wonder. Without shame. That's what stories like this give us. Not proof, but permission. Permission to become bigger than the borders of what we've been taught. Permission to shed an old identity, the obedient knower, and become something freer, a quiet seeker. You don't have to shout. You don't have to convince. You only need to stay open, just like Lazar did, the gravity of the unseen. There's a stillness that arrives when a story refuses to go away, not because it's loud, but because it lingers, like the echo of a bell long after it's been struck, like the feeling of a dream you can't quite recall, but can't quite forget. Bob Lazar's story has lived in that space for over 3 decades. People have tried to bury it, debunk it, laugh at it, ignore it, but it persists. And maybe that persistence isn't about how outrageous the claim was, but how quietly it confirmed something we already suspected, that we are not being told the whole story, that beneath the world of shopping lists and traffic lights and polite conversations, something else exists, something immense. Lazar described the propulsion system of the craft he studied as gravity amplification. Not thrust, not fuel, but gravity, manipulated, bent, amplified. That's not just exotic science. That's a different language of movement, a different understanding of space itself. And here's the part most people miss. Gravity doesn't just pull on objects, it pulls on belief. If you were told as a child that the world is made of matter, that matter obeys laws, and those laws are fixed, you believed it, because belief is how we anchor ourselves to reality. But what if those laws can bend? What if they were never fixed to begin with? That's not just a physics question. That's a self question. Because when the rules bend, so does your identity. And Lazar's story, it bends things. He spoke about a reactor the size of a basketball. He said it emitted no heat, no noise, just a quiet hum. He described seeing a test run, watching the craft lift and hover effortlessly, like it wasn't subject to gravity at all. Do you feel that? That flicker in your chest? Not the desire to believe, but the desire to know. That's what makes this story so powerful. It doesn't force you to believe. It invites you to remember that knowing and believing are different, and that some truths don't arrive through logic, but through resonance. And resonance is something you feel. Here's what's most human about Lazar. He never claimed to understand everything. He wasn't the hero of his own story. He was a witness, a reluctant one. And that reluctance, that refusal to dramatize, makes him more credible, not less. Because people who lie often overcompensate. But people who've seen something beyond words, they hesitate. They speak in fragments. They pause when others rush. That's the language of awe. Let me ask you something personal now. When was the last time you allowed yourself to live in awe, to dwell in not knowing without shame? We live in a world obsessed with answers, with confidence, with facts. But the most meaningful moments in life don't come from knowing. They come from wondering. Lazar's description of element 115, then unknown to science, wasn't just a claim. It was a challenge, a dare, to imagine a future not limited by today's knowledge. And years later, when a form of element 115 was synthesized, people wondered, was he right all along? Maybe, maybe not. But the real point isn't whether the element is stable. The point is that he introduced us to the idea before we were ready. That's what visionaries do. They make us uncomfortable. Not because they're wrong, but because they're early. And early is always lonely. Lazar said the craft operated by distorting space-time around itself. It didn't fly the way we think about flying. It fell into the space it created. No drag, no inertia, just shift. Do you hear the metaphor in that? That's transformation. To stop forcing your way forward, and instead, bend the world to fit your movement. How might that apply to your own life? What if you stopped struggling to push through the same resistance and instead asked, where can I shift? What can I bend in my reality by changing my relationship to it? Because that's what Lazar's story invites us to do. Not just marvel at alien physics, but use it as a mirror. You are not fixed. Your life is not bound by the old laws. There is space for the impossible within you. And maybe that's what the secret always was. Not craft, not propulsion, but permission. Permission to grow beyond what you've been told is possible, to become fluent in the language of mystery. Because once you do, reality becomes negotiable. And suddenly, you are no longer just a passenger in the story of your life. You're the architect, the weight of knowing. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels heavy, not the quiet of a calm mind, but the hush that follows revelation, the silence of someone who has seen too much and realizes they can't unsee it. Bob Lazar carried that silence, not like a badge, more like a wound. Most people think that discovering something extraordinary brings excitement. Maybe it does, for a moment. But what follows? If the thing you've discovered breaks the world in two, isn't excitement, it's isolation. Because now you carry something that no one else can verify, something that doesn't belong in conversations, something that turns you into the strange one, the difficult one, the person who makes other people uncomfortable just by speaking. You've felt that before, haven't you? Not in a lab, not in a facility, but maybe in your own life, in a moment where you knew something that others didn't want to hear. A truth about yourself, a realization about someone you loved, a clarity that made you a little less easy to be around. It's not that they were cruel, it's just they weren't ready. And that's the deepest loneliness of all, when your clarity becomes someone else's discomfort. Lazar didn't shout his story. He didn't rush to publish a book or build a brand. He didn't tour the conference circuit. Instead, he sat with it for years, quietly, until one day, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of exhaustion, he told someone. And then everything changed. What happens to a man when his truth becomes his threat? He said he was being watched, that he was followed, that his phones were tapped, that his life, once unremarkable, became a field of hidden eyes and silent pressure. Skeptics scoffed. But ask yourself, why would someone pretend to be hunted? Why choose fear when you could choose anonymity? There's a part of this story that people miss, not because it's hidden, but because it's human. Lazar was afraid, not just of government pressure or disinformation campaigns, but of being erased, not physically, existentially. To have everything you were, your history, your education, your credibility, systematically deleted. He said he worked at Los Alamos. Later, the lab claimed they had no record of him. But a phone directory was discovered, and there he was, listed, right where he said he'd be. Just a line in a book. But that line, it mattered, because it meant that he mattered, that he had existed, that the story hadn't swallowed him whole. Have you ever felt that? The urge to leave something behind, not for fame, but for proof? A mark that says, I was here. I wasn't imagining it. My experience was real. That's what Lazar's story became. Not just a claim, but a preservation of self. And maybe you've done that too. Held on to a truth no one believed. Not because you needed them to agree, but because letting it go would mean letting yourself go. That's the quiet heroism we don't talk about enough. Not standing up for crowds, but standing up for your own memory. In interviews, Lazar always looked tired. Not worn out, but worn down. Like someone who'd spent years defending something invisible. You could see it in his eyes, the fatigue of having to prove that you're not crazy. And here's the thing about truth. It doesn't need belief to exist, but people do. We need to be believed. It's one of the deepest human needs. to be seen, to be heard, to be trusted. Lazar wasn't asking for worship. He was asking not to disappear. And that's what makes his story less about aliens and more about identity. Because whether or not his account is real, in the way scientists would define real, what's undeniable is this: he risked everything to say it out loud. Can you say the same? What would you risk to speak your truth, even if no one believed you? Even if you lost your job? Even if your name became a punchline? Most of us live our whole lives trying to be accepted, to be agreeable, to be understood. But there's a deeper life waiting on the other side of that need, a life where the truth matters more than reputation, where peace comes not from validation, but from inner alignment. That's what Lazar found, I think. Not applause, not vindication, but a kind of strange, stubborn peace. The peace of a man who told his truth and then stepped back, not needing anyone to clap. He lives quietly now, still soft-spoken, still reluctant, still unchanged. Because sometimes integrity is measured not by how loudly you speak, but by how little you change your story when no one wants to hear it. That kind of stillness is rare and beautiful, and maybe something you carry too. Chapter 3: Too Big to Believe. Some truths don't get denied because they're false. They get denied because they're too big. There's a subtle trick the mind plays when it encounters something enormous, something that doesn't fit into its tidy folders of logic and memory. Instead of making space for it, the mind shrinks it, laughs at it, labels it as ridiculous, because ridicule is easier than rebuilding your entire worldview. And maybe that's what happened with Bob Lazar. Not because people were malicious, but because they were overwhelmed. He wasn't just asking us to consider the existence of advanced craft. He was asking us to consider that our entire civilization, our understanding of propulsion, of energy, of science, might be years, maybe centuries, behind something else. Can you feel the weight of that? We like to believe we're advanced. We carry devices in our pockets that connect us to the globe. We split atoms. We simulate consciousness. We peer into galaxies millions of light years away. But Lazar described machines that ignored inertia, that operated without combustion, that bent gravity like a child folding paper. And if that's real, then we're not just behind. We're infants. What would that mean for our pride, our politics, our power structures? You see, the resistance to Lazar's claims doesn't only come from skepticism. It comes from identity, from a collective self-image that needs to believe we're at the top of the pyramid. Because if we're not, then who is? And more importantly, why are they watching us? These are the questions people don't want to ask. Not because the answers are terrifying, but because the questions themselves strip away the illusion of control. Lazar didn't force those questions on us. He just lived them. He described sitting inside the craft, peering into its seamless interior, seeing control panels that seemed grown, not built, materials he couldn't recognize, systems he couldn't map, no bolts, no wiring, no instructions, just function and silence. A machine that didn't explain itself, much like the universe. And when he tried to explain what he saw, the world called him crazy. But maybe that's a defense mechanism. Maybe calling someone crazy is just how we protect the part of ourselves that doesn't want to evolve yet. Because evolution isn't always about improvement. Sometimes it's about surrender. letting go of the illusion that we're in charge, letting go of the myth that we know what's real. Ask yourself this: have you ever resisted something? Not because it was untrue, but because it made you feel small. That's what Lazar represents. Not danger, but humility. And humility is hard. It strips us of superiority. It says, maybe we're not the most intelligent species. Maybe we don't know what energy is or how it works. Maybe there are laws of physics we haven't even glimpsed yet. And in that space, we soften. Because humility, once accepted, becomes freedom. It's only when you stop pretending to know everything that you become teachable, expandable, capable of wonder again. And wonder is the seed of transformation. That's the gift Lazar offered. Not just information, but initiation. An invitation to reimagine what's possible. Not just out there, in the desert, under classified roofs, but in here, inside the mind, inside you. Because what happens out there always mirrors what's happening within. And maybe, just maybe, that's why stories like this survive. Not because we're obsessed with secrets, but because deep down, we're desperate to evolve. But here's the paradox. We can't evolve until we admit there's something beyond us. That's what Lazar's presence does. He doesn't just tell us about advanced technology. He reminds us that we are not finished. We are not the final form. We are not yet fully awake. And maybe that's not frightening at all. Maybe that's beautiful, because it means the story of humanity isn't over. It's just beginning. Chapter 4: The Loneliness of Seeing. There is a silence that's louder than any argument. It's the silence you meet when you speak your truth, and the world blinks back at you with indifference. Bob Lazar lives in that silence, not because he's wrong, not because he's lying, but because he said something that made the world too uncomfortable to engage. He told us what he saw, and most of us looked away. It's a strange thing, isn't it? The idea that someone can say something extraordinary, world-altering, paradigm-breaking, and instead of being met with curiosity, they're met with exile. That's the cost of seeing. Not the seeing itself, but the aftermath. When you return from the edge with something valuable, something profound, and no one wants it, it's not that they don't believe you. It's that they can't. Because to believe you would mean they'd have to change. And people don't change easily. Think about your own life. Have you ever had a moment of deep knowing? Something clear, vivid, undeniable. And when you tried to share it, you were met with polite smiles. Or worse, silence. It's a kind of grief, isn't it? Not just for the truth that's ignored, but for the version of you that must now carry it alone. That's what makes Lazar's story more human than most people realize. It's not about spaceships or propulsion systems. It's about the emotional weight of being awake in a sleeping world. He spoke of being shown briefings, documents suggesting extraterrestrial origins, details he wasn't allowed to copy, or question, or photograph, only read, quickly, under watch. And if you've ever been handed a truth you weren't prepared for, you know what that feels like. It doesn't inspire power. It leaves you trembling. Because once you know, you can't unknow. Once you see, you can't unsee. And once you speak, you cross a line that you can't return from. That's what Bob Lazar did. He crossed that line, and then he lived there, in the space between belief and denial, in the ache between I saw it and no, you didn't. And that's where real strength is forged, not in the excitement of discovery, but in the quiet that follows. When your truth isn't met with applause, when your clarity doesn't bring connection, when your honesty costs you more than it rewards, that's when integrity becomes real. That's when character is tested, not by what you know, but by how you carry it, without bitterness, without arrogance, without the need to be right, just steady. Lazar never shouted, never demanded the world agree. He simply told his story and let it land where it would. There's something powerful in that, something rare, because we live in a time of noise, of shouting, of people scrambling to be seen, to be validated, to win. But what if your power didn't come from winning? What if it came from holding your truth gently, not like a weapon, but like a flame, a quiet, flickering warmth that says, I know what I saw, and I'm still here. And maybe that's where your own story intersects with his. Not because you've seen a spacecraft, but because you too have carried something that others couldn't hold. A pain, a knowing, a possibility. And like Lazar, you may have discovered that the world doesn't always respond the way you hoped. That people can be afraid of what you represent, not because you're dangerous, but because you remind them of what they've avoided. But here's the beauty of that path. The longer you walk it, the lighter it becomes. Not because it gets easier, but because you grow stronger. And one day, maybe you look back, not with regret, but with grace. Because you realize that speaking your truth wasn't a disruption. It was an initiation into a deeper kind of honesty, a quieter kind of courage, and a wider, more mysterious life. Chapter 5. The Price of Forbidden Knowledge. There is a strange tension in the world between what is known and what is allowed to be known. Bob Lazar's story lives squarely in that tension. He revealed glimpses of something forbidden, not just technology, but knowledge locked away, labeled top secret, sealed behind gates no ordinary citizen can pass. Why do we do that? Why do we build walls around certain truths? It's not just about national security. It's about control. The mind instinctively recoils from the unknown, and when the unknown threatens our collective sense of order, we create boundaries, legal, social, psychological, to keep it at bay. Secrets become weapons. They become shields. They become prisons. And those who hold the keys are granted power. Lazar, by speaking out, challenged that power. He crossed a line no one else dared cross publicly. But what does it mean to be a seeker in a world that shuns seekers? It means learning to live with discomfort, to hold space for questions that don't have answers, to accept that some doors might never open. Yet, the seeker persists. Because there's a fire that burns beneath certainty, a hunger for more. And that hunger is a quiet revolution. It says, I will not settle for the story they give me. It says, I am willing to look, even if it scares me. And that willingness is where transformation begins. Lazar's story invites us not just to question what's out there, but what's inside us. What truths have we locked away? What wonder have we buried under layers of realism and practicality? When the mind opens to possibility, the heart follows, and the world shifts. Perhaps then, the greatest secret isn't about alien craft or secret bases. It's about remembering how to be curious, to be brave, to be awake. Because the cost of forbidden knowledge isn't just the burden of knowing, it's the courage to keep seeking, to keep asking, to keep believing, even when belief feels dangerous. And in that courage, you find your power, not the power of secrets kept in shadow, but the power of light, of clarity, of truth, of freedom. Chapter 6: Awakening Beyond the Story. What if this story, Lazar's story, is less about craft, propulsion, or government cover-ups, and more about awakening? What if it's an invitation to step beyond the comfortable illusions that shape our daily lives? You see, stories like Lazar's serve a deeper purpose. They crack open the walls we've built around possibility, curiosity, and wonder. They remind us that the world is far more complex and far more mysterious than we admit. You might be lying in your bed now, somewhere quiet, your mind wandering between sleep and wakefulness. And this story, quietly, asks you, what do you believe about the limits of your own life? About the boundaries of what's possible? Because in the same way Lazar saw beyond the surface, past the fences and classified files, we are called to look beyond our own mental fences, beyond the voices that say, "You're not enough," beyond the stories of limitation, fear, and doubt. What if your gravity is not something you fight against? What if your life isn't about pushing harder, but about bending space, finding the pathways that shift the impossible into the possible? Lazar's story carries a quiet encouragement. That transformation often looks less like force and more like surrender. Surrender, not in defeat, but in trust. Trust that the unknown isn't your enemy. Trust that mystery is a place of power, not fear. Trust that to evolve, you must be willing to live with questions that don't yet have answers. This is the paradox of awakening. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about being willing to not have it all figured out and still move forward, to walk in faith, even when the path is dark, even when others call you crazy, because that's where growth happens. That's where the real transformation begins. Bob Lazar's journey is a mirror for all of us, not because we all saw alien craft, but because we all face moments where the world asks us to choose between comfort and truth, between safety and awakening, between sleeping and waking. And as you drift towards sleep tonight, know this: the story is not just about what Lazar saw. It's about what you choose to see, about what you choose to believe possible, about the space you create for wonder to live inside your life. Because that space, that silent, sacred space, is where the future is born, and where you, quietly, become more than you ever imagined. There is a power in belief that few understand. Not belief as blind faith, not belief as certainty, but belief as a quiet act of courage. Bob Lazar's story challenges us to hold that kind of belief, to believe in something beyond the visible, beyond the accepted, beyond the convenient. Because belief, when it's genuine, doesn't demand proof. It doesn't need validation. It simply is. And in that simple being, it changes everything. Think about the moments in your life when belief shifted something inside you. Maybe it was belief in your own strength, belief that you could heal, belief that you could start again, belief that the darkness wouldn't last forever. That kind of belief carries a weight, a quiet power that moves mountains, not outside, but within. Lazar's story asks us to step into that power, to hold space for things that might seem impossible, to accept that reality is bigger than the stories we tell ourselves, to recognize that mystery is not something to fear, but something to embrace. Because when you embrace mystery, you reclaim your own power, your power to imagine, to question, to transform, to live fully awake. The world may call that naive. It may call it foolish. But those who carry belief gently, steadily, persistently, those are the ones who move humanity forward. They are the quiet revolutionaries, the invisible builders of new worlds. And as you listen, maybe you feel that stirring inside, a seed of possibility, a whisper that says, there is more than what you see, more than what you've been told, more than you've allowed yourself to believe. And that whisper is your invitation to wake up, to look beyond the fences, to speak your truth, no matter how strange it may seem, to hold your knowing, even in silence, because that is the true power, not to be believed by the world, but to believe in yourself. And in that belief, find freedom, find peace, find the courage to keep seeking. Because the story of Bob Lazar is not just his. It's a reflection of the part of us all that longs to know more, to be more, to awaken. And as you close your eyes tonight, may you carry that power gently with you. May it guide you through the darkness. May it remind you that the future is yours to shape, quietly, bravely, with belief. As we draw near to the close of this story, this winding journey through secrets, courage, and the vast unknown, there is something tender waiting for you, an invitation, not to solve the mystery, not to unravel every thread, but to rest deeply. Chapter 7. The Echoes Remain. Bob Lazar's story never truly ended. It simply faded gently into the collective subconscious of those who listened, like a half-remembered dream that lingers in the morning stillness. Whether you believed every word or simply saw it as a reflection of our yearning for the stars, his words carved a space in the conversation about who we are and what might be watching us. Years passed. Governments changed. Classified documents were leaked. Fighter pilots reported encounters with things they couldn't explain. And each time the news cycle returned to the question of extraterrestrial life, Lazar's name reemerged. Not shouted, but whispered as if to say, "He told us long ago." His legacy became something more than evidence or theory. It became folklore, not in the sense of fiction, but in the sense of persistence. A story passed quietly from one truth seeker to another, shared in dorm rooms, on late-night drives, in forums buried deep in the web. Have you heard about Bob Lazar? And the younger generations, those born long after he spoke out, found themselves captivated, not because he had answers, but because he asked the right questions. What is gravity really? Why do governments hide what they find? And if something not from this earth was ever recovered, what would it mean for everything we know? That's the thing about the Lazar story. It isn't about saucers or science. It's about perspective, about how fragile our understanding of reality might be, about how quickly the line between ordinary and impossible can be crossed with one strange invitation to a desert facility. Many who encountered Bob Lazar's tale didn't walk away convinced, but they did walk away changed. Suddenly, the world felt bigger, more complex, and that sliver of doubt, what if he was right, never quite left them. That is the mark of a story with staying power. In the end, perhaps Bob Lazar wasn't just a scientist or a whistleblower or a myth. Perhaps he was a mirror, a reflection of our deepest desire to know the unknown, to pull back the curtain and glimpse what lies beyond. And even if the view is brief and the image unclear, it still tells us something vital that we are not done exploring. Late at night, if you sit in silence and think back to his story, about sport model craft and gravity amplifiers, about an element beyond the periodic table, about a hangar carved into the Nevada earth. You may not find the answers, but you may feel something else. Curiosity, wonder, a sense of scale. Maybe Lazar's role was never to prove. Maybe it was to provoke, to awaken a question that can't be silenced by skepticism alone, a question that keeps you looking up even when there's nothing visible in the sky. In that way, his legacy remains airborne, suspended in the same space his story emerged from. Above the mountains, beyond the lights, between the known and the unknowable, and it waits patiently for us to catch up. The desert is quiet now. The wind still moves across Groom Lake. The facility, if it ever existed, remains sealed behind fences and sand. But somewhere out there, beyond the dust and stars, something may still hover, silent, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers the man who tried to speak for it. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, let the mystery settle around you. Let the silence speak, and let the story of Bob Lazar be a soft murmur in the darkness. A reminder that some truths hide not in what we know, but in what we dare to imagine. In the space between knowing and unknowing, it's a rare gift, isn't it? To let go of the need to always understand, to surrender the desire to control the story, to explain it, to fit it neatly into our lives. Some mysteries resist explanation because they're alive, because they breathe and shift and grow, because their edges dissolve when we try to grasp them too tightly. Bob Lazar's story is like that. It's a door cracked open, a whisper of something vast, something unfathomable waiting beyond. And yet, that door doesn't demand you walk through it right now. It simply invites you to pause, to breathe, to rest in the quiet tension of the unknown. And here's the paradox. It is only when you rest in the unknown that you become truly awake, that you become free, because the mind spends so much of its energy resisting mystery, trying to explain away the strange, trying to make the impossible safe, familiar, manageable. But the deepest transformation, the kind that changes you from the inside out, comes when you stop fighting, when you stop pushing, when you allow yourself to just be with what is, right here, right now. Maybe you don't have answers about Area 51, about Bob Lazar, about whether extraterrestrial craft truly exist, and that's okay. Maybe you never will. But what if that doesn't matter? What if the real story isn't about proof or facts? What if the real story is about the way you carry the questions, the courage it takes to hold them gently, to live with the tension of uncertainty without giving in to fear or cynicism? That's the quiet power you carry. A power that doesn't shout, that doesn't demand belief or applause. It's the power to be comfortable with mystery, to welcome the unknown as a friend, to see that the greatest secrets aren't hidden in deserts or classified files. They are hidden within us, in our capacity for wonder, in our willingness to stay curious when the world grows dark, to keep our hearts open when everything inside urges us to close. And as you lie here, letting your breath soften, let this truth sink in. You are part of something far larger than you can imagine. A vast, unfolding mystery, an endless story, a dance between light and shadow, certainty and doubt, sleep and awakening. And in this dance, you have a role. Not to know everything, not to have it all figured out, but to show up, to carry your truth softly, to hold space for possibility, to be the calm, steady presence that reminds the world, reminds yourself that mystery is not to be feared, but to be embraced. Because it is in that embrace that freedom lives, that transformation takes root, that the next chapter unfolds. So rest now. Feel the steady rhythm of your breath. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the surface beneath you. Feel the quiet pulse of life flowing through you. And know, deep in your bones, that it's enough. That you are enough. That the story you carry, no matter how strange, how uncertain, how lonely, is sacred. That your courage to believe, to wonder, to hold space for the unknown, is a gift to the world. And as you drift into sleep, carried by the gentle waves of rest, remember this: the search is not over. The journey is not finished. But right now, in this moment, you can rest. You can be still. You can simply be. And from that stillness, the seeds of tomorrow will grow. Quietly, bravely, beautifully. Good night.